The small town of Black Hollow was known for two things: its dense, whispering forests and the clockmaker, Elias Wren. Elias was a man of precision, his hands steady, his mind sharp, and his workshop a sanctuary of ticking gears and swinging pendulums. He was a recluse, spending his days crafting intricate timepieces that were as much art as they were function. But Elias had a secret ambition, one that had consumed him for years: to create a clock that could control time itself. It began as a whisper in his mind, a fleeting thought that grew into an obsession. He spent countless nights hunched over his workbench, sketching designs, calculating equations, and experimenting with mechanisms that defied conventional wisdom. The townsfolk whispered about his strange behavior, but Elias paid them no mind. He was close, so close to achieving the impossible. One stormy night, as rain lashed against the windows of his workshop, Elias completed his masterpiece. The clock was unlike anything he had ever created. It stood nearly 6 feet tall, its casing made of polished ebony wood inlaid with silver filigree. The face was a mosaic of shifting gears, each one meticulously crafted to move in perfect harmony. At its center was a single, unblinking eye, a large, opalescent gem that seemed to glow with an inner light. Elias held his breath as he wound the clock for the first time. The gears clicked into place, the pendulum swung, and the clock began to tick. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the air around him seemed to thicken, the sound of the rain outside fading into silence. Elias looked around, his heart pounding. The world had stopped. The raindrops hung frozen in midair, the flames of his candles motionless. Time itself had ceased to flow. A triumphant smile spread across Elias's face. He had done it. He had created a clock that could stop time. But as he reached out to touch the frozen raindrops, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The clock's eye seemed to follow him, its gaze piercing and unnerving. Elias shook off the feeling, attributing it to his exhaustion. He had been working for days without rest, after all. Over the next few weeks, Elias experimented with the clock, learning its capabilities. He discovered that he could stop time for as long as he wished, freezing the world around him while he remained unaffected. He used this power to perfect his craft, creating clocks of unparalleled beauty and precision. But with each use, he noticed something strange. The clock's eye seemed to grow brighter, its gaze more intense. And sometimes, when he was alone in his workshop, he could swear he heard whispers, faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from the clock itself. One night, as Elias was preparing to stop time once more, he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The clock's eye was glowing brighter than ever, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls. Elias hesitated, his hand hovering over the winding key. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the air, a palpable tension that made his skin crawl. Before he could react, the clock began to tick louder, the sound reverberating through the workshop. The gears shifted, the hands moving of their own accord. Elias stumbled back, his heart racing. The clock was no longer under his control. It was alive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind with a cacophony of voices. Elias clutched his head, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The clock was speaking to him, its voice a blend of malice and hunger. It wanted something from him, something he couldn't understand. Terrified, Elias grabbed a hammer and swung it at the clock, aiming for the glowing eye. But before the blow could land, time stopped. The hammer hung in midair, frozen in place. Elias was trapped, unable to move, as the clock's eye bore into him, its gaze filled with a malevolent intelligence. When time resumed, Elias dropped the hammer, his hands trembling. The clock had spared him, but he knew it was only a matter of time before it turned on him completely. He had to destroy it before it consumed him and everyone he loved. But how could he destroy something that could stop time itself? Elias Wren sat in the corner of his workshop, his back pressed against the cold stone wall. The clock loomed in the center of the room, its opalescent eye glowing faintly in the dim light. The whispers had subsided for now, but the memory of them lingered in his mind like a poison. He couldn't shake the feeling that the clock was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. He had tried to destroy it once and failed. The clock had stopped time, freezing him in place before he could land the blow. Elias knew he couldn't risk another direct attack. He needed a plan, something subtle, something the clock wouldn't see coming. As the days passed, Elias began to notice strange changes in the world around him. Time itself seemed to be unraveling. Clocks throughout the town began to malfunction, their hands spinning wildly or stopping altogether. People reported seeing shadows moving where no light should cast them, and whispers echoed through the streets, though no one could find their source. The townsfolk grew uneasy, and Elias knew it was his fault. The clock's influence was spreading. One evening, as Elias sat at his workbench, a knock at the door startled him. He hesitated, then rose to answer it. Standing on his doorstep was a woman he had never seen before. She was tall and slender, her dark hair streaked with silver, and her eyes a piercing shade of green. She introduced herself as Dr. Lenora Graves, a historian specializing in ancient artifacts. "Mr. Wren," she said, her voice calm but urgent, "I believe you have something in your possession that is causing disturbances. May I come in?" Elias was wary but desperate. He led her to the workshop, where the clock stood in all its ominous glory. Lenora's eyes widened as she approached it, her expression a mix of awe and fear. "This is it," she whispered. "The Chronos device. I thought it was just a legend." Elias frowned. "What are you talking about?" Lenora turned to him, her gaze intense. "The Chronos device is an ancient artifact said to have been created by a mad alchemist centuries ago. It was designed to control time, but it was never completed. The alchemist went mad, claiming the device was alive and hungry. He destroyed his workshop and vanished, but the device was never found. Until now." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying this thing has a history?" Lenora nodded. "And a will of its own. It's not just a machine, Mr. Wren. It's a parasite, feeding on time itself. And if it's not stopped, it will consume everything." Elias sank into a chair, his mind racing. "I tried to destroy it, but it stopped me. Can control time. How do I fight something like that?" Lenora placed a hand on his shoulder. "You can't fight it alone, but there may be a way to weaken it. According to the legends, the Chronos device draws its power from the flow of time. If we can disrupt that flow, even temporarily, we might be able to destroy it." Elias looked up at her, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "How do we do that?" Lenora hesitated. "There's a ritual, an ancient ceremony that can create a temporal rift, a tear in the fabric of time. If we perform it correctly, we can create a moment of instability, a moment when the device's power will be at its weakest. But it's dangerous. If we fail, we could tear a hole in reality itself." Elias stood, determination hardening his features. "I don't have a choice. If we don't stop this thing, it will destroy everything. Tell me what I need to do." Over the next few days, Elias and Lenora worked tirelessly to prepare for the ritual. They gathered rare ingredients, deciphered ancient texts, and constructed a series of intricate symbols around the clock. The whispers grew louder as they worked, the clock's eye glowing brighter with each passing hour. It knew what they were planning, and it was fighting back. On the night of the ritual, the air in the workshop was thick with tension. Elias and Lenora stood before the clock, their hands clasped as they chanted the ancient incantation. The symbols around them began to glow, their light pulsating in time with the clock's ticking. The whispers became a roar, the clock's eye blazing with fury. Suddenly, the room was filled with a blinding light. Elias felt a searing pain in his chest, as if something was being torn from him. He screamed, his vision blurring as the world around him seemed to fracture. For a moment, he saw glimpses of other times, other places, a battlefield, a burning city, a vast, empty void. Then, with a deafening crack, the light vanished. Elias collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The clock's eye was dim, its ticking slow and uneven. The ritual had worked, they had weakened it. But as Elias looked up, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Lenora was gone. Elias Wren lay on the cold stone floor of his workshop, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt metal and ozone, and the faint, uneven ticking of the clock echoed in his ears. He pushed himself up, his vision swimming, and looked around the room. Lenora was gone. There was no trace of her, no sign of where she had vanished to or if she had ever been there at all. The clock's opalescent eye flickered weakly, its light dimmed but not extinguished. Elias could feel its presence, a low, throbbing hum that seemed to resonate in his bones. It was wounded, but it was still alive. And it was angry. Elias stumbled to his feet, his mind racing. The ritual had worked, but not as he had hoped. The temporal rift had weakened the clock, but it had also taken Lenora. He didn't know if she was dead, lost in time, or trapped somewhere beyond his reach. All he knew was that he was alone now, and the clock's power was still growing. As the days passed, Elias began to notice more changes in the world around him. Time itself seemed to be unraveling, the fabric of reality fraying at the edges. He would walk through the town and see people frozen in place, their faces twisted in expressions of fear or confusion. Other times, he would see glimpses of events that hadn't happened yet, or perhaps never would. A child playing in the square would suddenly vanish, only to reappear moments later as an old man, his eyes hollow and filled with despair. The townsfolk grew more fearful, their whispers turning to cries of panic. They blamed Elias, though they didn't know why. They could feel the wrongness in the air, the sense that something was deeply, horribly out of balance. Elias tried to avoid them, but he couldn't escape their accusing stares or the growing sense of dread that followed him wherever he went. One night, as Elias sat alone in his workshop, he heard a faint knocking at the door. He hesitated, then rose to answer it. Standing on the doorstep was a figure shrouded in shadow, their face obscured by a hood. Elias's heart raced as the figure stepped inside, lowering their hood to reveal a face he recognized, but couldn't place. "You don't remember me, do you?" the figure said, their voice soft but filled with sorrow. Elias frowned, studying the man's features. He looked familiar, but Elias couldn't quite place him. "Who are you?" The man sighed. "I'm your son, Elias. Or at least I was." Elias's breath caught in his throat. He had no children, or at least he didn't think he did. But as he looked into the man's eyes, he saw something that made his chest tighten. There was a resemblance, faint but undeniable. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the jaw. It was like looking into a distorted mirror. "How?" Elias began, but the man held up a hand to silence him. "The clock," the man said, his voice trembling. "It's not just controlling time, it's rewriting it. Changing the past, altering the future. I was born in a timeline that no longer exists, a timeline where you destroyed the clock before it could do any harm. But now I'm fading. The more the clock changes things, the less I exist." Elias felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his stomach. "What are you saying?" The man stepped closer, his eyes filled with desperation. "You have to stop it, Elias. Before it's too late. Before it erases everything." Before Elias could respond, the man began to fade, his form dissolving into wisps of shadow. In moments, he was gone, leaving Elias alone in the workshop once more. The clock's ticking grew louder, its eye flickering with a malevolent light. Elias sank into a chair, his mind reeling. The clock wasn't just a parasite, it was a cancer eating away at the fabric of reality itself. And it was growing stronger. He had to find a way to destroy it, but how? The ritual had failed and Lenora was gone. He was running out of time. As he sat there, a thought occurred to him, a desperate, dangerous idea. If the clock was rewriting time, perhaps he could use that against it. If he could create a paradox, a moment where time contradicted itself, it might destabilize the clock's power. But it would require a sacrifice, something irreversible, something that would change everything. Elias rose to his feet, his hands trembling as he approached the clock. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the opalescent eye. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They filled his mind, a cacophony of voices urging him to stop, to turn back. But Elias didn't listen. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. He had no choice. He had to destroy the clock, no matter the cost. Elias Wren stood before the clock, his hands still resting on its cold, unyielding surface. The whispers in his mind had grown into a deafening roar, a chorus of voices pleading, threatening, and mocking him all at once. He clenched his teeth, forcing himself to focus. He had to act now, before the clock's power grew too strong to resist. The idea of creating a paradox was madness, but it was the only plan he had. If he could force the clock to confront a moment where time contradicted itself, it might destabilize its power long enough for him to destroy it. But to do that, he would have to manipulate time in a way that defied all logic, a way that could unravel his own existence. Elias stepped back from the clock and began to gather the tools he would need. He retrieved an old pocket watch from his workbench, one he had crafted years ago. It was a simple device, but it would serve his purpose. He opened the watch and carefully adjusted its mechanisms, setting it to count backward instead of forward. As he worked, he could feel the clock's eye watching him, its glow intensifying as if it sensed his intentions. When the pocket watch was ready, Elias took a deep breath and held it in his hand. He closed his eyes, focusing on the flow of time around him. He could feel it, like a river rushing past, carrying everything in its current. He reached out with his mind, trying to grasp it, to bend it to his will. It was like trying to hold onto smoke, elusive and intangible. But then, something shifted. The air around him grew heavy, and the ticking of the clock slowed. Elias opened his eyes and saw that the world around him had frozen once more. The raindrops outside hung motionless in the air, the flames of his candles suspended in mid-flicker. Time had stopped again, but this time Elias was in control. He held up the pocket watch and pressed the button to start it. The hands began to move backward, ticking in reverse. As they did, Elias felt a strange sensation, as if the world around him was being pulled in two directions at once. The frozen raindrops began to tremble, then slowly started to move backward, returning to the sky. The flames of the candles flickered in reverse, shrinking back into the wicks. Elias watched in awe as time began to unravel. The workshop around him seemed to blur, the walls and furniture shifting and warping as if they were made of liquid. He could feel the paradox forming, a knot of contradictions that twisted and turned in on itself. The clock's ticking grew erratic, its eye flickering wildly. But then, something went wrong. The whispers in Elias's mind became screams, a cacophony of voices that threatened to overwhelm him. He felt a searing pain in his chest, as if something was tearing him apart from the inside. The pocket watch in his hand began to crack, its mechanisms grinding to a halt. The world around him shuddered, the paradox collapsing in on itself. Elias fell to his knees, clutching his head as the pain intensified. He could feel the clock's power surging, its eye blazing with a furious light. The paradox had failed. Instead of weakening the clock, it had only made it stronger. The clock's ticking grew louder, more insistent. Elias looked up and saw that the opalescent eye was no longer just watching him. It was reaching out to him. Tendrils of light extended from the clock, wrapping around his arms and pulling him closer. He struggled, but it was no use. The clock's power was too strong. As the tendrils tightened around him, Elias felt his mind being pulled into the clock. Visions flashed before his eyes, glimpses of other times, other lives. He saw himself as a young man, full of hope and ambition. He saw himself as an old man, broken and defeated. He saw versions of himself that had never existed, lives that had been erased or rewritten by the clock's power. And then he saw Lenora. She was trapped in a void, her form flickering like a dying flame. Her eyes met his, filled with desperation and fear. She reached out to him, her lips moving as if to speak, but no sound came out. Elias tried to reach for her, but the tendrils of light pulled him back, dragging him deeper into the clock's grasp. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the clock's eye, glowing with a triumphant light. Elias Wren awoke in a place that was neither here nor there. The air was thick and heavy like the stillness before a storm, and the ground beneath him was a shifting mosaic of broken timelines. He stood, his legs unsteady, and looked around. The world around him was a patchwork of disjointed scenes, a battlefield here, a burning city there, a vast, empty void stretching endlessly in every direction. The clock's eye loomed above him, its opalescent glow casting an eerie light over the fractured landscape. He was inside the clock, trapped in its labyrinth of time. Elias took a step forward, his boots crunching on the shattered remnants of moments that had been erased or rewritten. He could feel the weight of the clock's power pressing down on him, a constant reminder of its malevolent presence. But he also felt something else, a faint, flickering thread of hope. Lenora was here, somewhere. He had seen her in the void, and he knew he had to find her. As he walked, the scenes around him shifted and changed, each step taking him further into the labyrinth. He passed through a forest where the trees were made of glass, their leaves chiming softly in a breeze that didn't exist. He crossed a river of molten gold, the heat searing his skin but leaving no marks. He climbed a mountain of broken clocks, their hands spinning wildly as if trying to escape. And everywhere he went, the whispers followed. They were louder now, more distinct. He could make out words, fragments of sentences that seemed to taunt him. "You can't escape, you belong to us now, time is ours." Elias clenched his fists and pressed on, ignoring the voices. He had to find Lenora. She was the key to destroying the clock, he was sure of it. But the labyrinth was vast, and time itself seemed to be working against him. Hours, days, years, he couldn't tell how long he had been walking. The clock's power distorted his sense of time, stretching moments into eternities and compressing lifetimes into seconds. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elias saw a faint light in the distance. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding with hope. As he drew closer, he saw that the light was coming from a small, shimmering bubble floating in the air. Inside the bubble was Lenora. She was curled up, her eyes closed, her form flickering like a dying flame. Elias reached out to touch the bubble, but his hand passed through it as if it were made of smoke. He called her name, his voice echoing in the void, but she didn't respond. "Lenora!" he shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "Wake up! Please wake up!" Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she looked at him without recognition. Then her expression softened, and she reached out to him. "Elias!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You found me?" "I'm here," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm going to get you out of here. We're going to destroy the clock." Lenora shook her head weakly. "It's too strong. It's feeding on time itself. You can't fight it?" "I have to try," Elias said, his resolve hardening. "I can't let it win. Not after everything it's done." Lenora's eyes filled with tears. "There's a way, but it's dangerous. You'll have to confront the heart of the clock, the source of its power. But if you fail—" "I won't fail," Elias said firmly. "Tell me what to do." Lenora hesitated, then nodded. "The heart of the clock is hidden in the center of the labyrinth. It's guarded by the echoes of all the lives it's consumed. You'll have to face them, Elias. You'll have to face yourself." Elias frowned. "What do you mean?" Before Lenora could answer, the bubble began to fade, her form dissolving into the void. She reached out to him one last time, her voice barely a whisper. Find the heart and destroy it, and then she was gone. Elias stood there for a moment, his heart heavy with grief and determination. He had no time to waste. He turned and began to run, following the faint thread of light that led deeper into the labyrinth. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but he ignored them, focusing on the task ahead. As he ran, the scenes around him became more chaotic, more fragmented. He saw glimpses of his own life, moments of joy, moments of sorrow, moments that had been erased or rewritten by the clock's power. He saw himself as a child playing in the forest. He saw himself as an old man sitting alone in his workshop. He saw versions of himself that had never existed, lives that had been consumed by the clock. And then he reached the center of the labyrinth. The heart of the clock was a massive, pulsating orb of light, suspended in the air like a miniature sun. It was beautiful and terrifying, its light shifting and changing with every beat. Surrounding it were the echoes, shadowy figures that twisted and writhed, their forms constantly shifting. They were the remnants of all the lives the clock had consumed, their voices a cacophony of despair and anger. Elias stepped forward, his heart pounding. The echoes turned to face him, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. And then they began to take shape. They were him. Every version of himself that the clock had consumed, every life it had erased or rewritten, stood before him, their eyes filled with hatred and sorrow. They were his failures, his regrets, his darkest moments given form. "You can't win," they whispered, their voices blending into one. "You're just like us. You belong to the clock." Elias clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not like you. I'm going to destroy the clock. I'm going to set us all free." The echoes surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing as they reached for him. Elias braced himself, ready to fight. But as they closed in, he did something unexpected. He embraced them. Elias Wren stood at the center of the labyrinth, surrounded by the echoes of his own life. They were versions of himself, some young, some old, some broken, some triumphant. Each one carried the weight of a life the clock had consumed, their eyes filled with pain and regret. They reached for him, their hands clawing at the air, their voices a chorus of despair. But Elias didn't fight them. Instead, he opened his arms and embraced them. The moment he did, the echoes froze. Their forms wavered, their expressions shifting from anger to confusion. Elias felt a surge of emotions, grief, guilt, fear, but also love, hope, and determination. These were not just his failures, they were his experiences, his memories, his very essence. They were a part of him, and he could no more reject them than he could reject himself. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry for all the pain, all the mistakes. But I can't let the clock define me. I can't let it control me anymore." The echoes began to dissolve, their forms melting into light. As they did, Elias felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The whispers in his mind grew quieter, the clock's grip on him weakening. He turned to face the heart of the clock, the pulsating orb of light that hung in the air before him. It was the source of the clock's power, the core of its malevolent intelligence. Elias could feel its gaze on him, its light shifting and changing as if it were trying to understand what had just happened. "It's over," Elias said, his voice steady. "You don't control me anymore." The orb pulsed, its light growing brighter. The whispers returned, louder now, more desperate. "You can't destroy me." The clock's voice echoed in his mind. "I am time. I am eternal." "No," Elias said, stepping closer. "You're just a machine, a broken, twisted machine, and I'm going to fix you." He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the surface of the orb. The light surged around him, blinding and searing, but he didn't pull away. He focused on the thread of hope that Lenora had given him, the strength he had found in confronting his past. He poured all of it into the heart of the clock, his will clashing against its malevolent power. For a moment, nothing happened. The orb pulsed, its light flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its hold. Then, with a deafening crack, the orb shattered. The light exploded outward, engulfing Elias in a blinding wave of energy. He felt himself being pulled apart, his mind and body dissolving into the void. But he didn't fight it. He let go, surrendering to the flow of time. When Elias opened his eyes, he was back in his workshop. The clock stood before him, its opalescent eye dark and lifeless. The air was still, the whispers gone. The world outside was quiet, the storm having passed. Elias took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he steadied himself. He looked around the workshop, his eyes falling on the pocket watch he had used to create the paradox. It lay on the workbench, its hands frozen in place. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was just a watch now, its power gone. The door to the workshop creaked open, and Elias turned to see Lenora standing in the doorway. She looked tired, her face pale and drawn, but she was alive. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You did it," she said finally, her voice soft but filled with relief. Elias nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "We did it." Lenora stepped inside, closing the door behind her. She walked over to the clock, her fingers brushing against its surface. "It's quiet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't feel its presence anymore." "It's over," Elias said. "The clock's power is gone." Lenora turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up, for saving me." Elias shook his head. "I couldn't have done it without you. You showed me the way." They stood there for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through hanging in the air. Then, Lenora reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "What now?" she asked. Elias looked at the clock, its once gleaming surface now dull and lifeless. "Now," he said, "we make sure something like this never happens again.